I will sort of skip through a page of information about Fred and hit the highlights here. That he graduated initially from Bowie State College, and I thought, look at it, boy, that was right next to Fort George G. Meade, where I was stationed for 2 years in the Army there. But he then went to Kent University. I think it was somewhat after the Kent State Massacre in 1970. And ended up in Holland, Michigan for a degree and Master's of Divinity at Western Theological. Served in the Marine Corps as a communication electronics officer, and then worked in industry for a while that I won't bring you those details. But at Hope, one of the things that I really found important in his CV was that he got numerous awards from the students as being their favorite professor, and Hope's outstanding professor educator. The acronym is HOPE. That was original. Okay. But to get those kind of accolades from the students, from his students, is an amazing achievement. He was active in the International Toastmasters organization. So, and it says here, he advanced to the semifinals 8 times. You would think either you give up or, it's like being losing the national championship, I guess, 8 times. But that's amazing. He won't surprise you because he's a fantastic speaker. Also in November of 2019, the Elizabeth Schuyler Hamilton chapter of the National Society of the Daughters for American Revolution, DAR, awarded Dr. Johnson with the Medal of Honor, which is the most prestigious award that the DAR presents. For a United States citizen by birth that has shown extraordinary qualities of leadership, trustworthiness, service, patriotism. The recipient must have made unusual and lasting contributions to our American heritage by giving of himself or herself to his or her community, state, country, and fellow man. It is a pleasure to have Fred here and to listen to him once more talk about a subject that we are all wondering about with his critical race theory. I looked that up on Wikipedia because I don't know if I know much more about it after reading about 4 pages of information, but critical is the thing that came up. It's not criticism, but critical thinking that goes into this. So I'm sure that Fred will expand on this, so hopefully by the end of the afternoon we'll all understand what it's all about. And so I would ask you to give a grand forum welcome to Fred Johnson.
That was great. Somebody's got a career in stand-up, don't you think? Thank you very much. I want you all to know that 55 minutes ago, I was in South Haven, dressed in sweat clothes. Nothing will so strengthen your faith like trying to get someplace in Michigan road traffic during construction. Let's get started. I want to answer your questions or address this issue of critical race theory, which has been causing so much concern, so much discussion, in some places fear, anger, a whole range of emotions over the last 2 years. This is from, I've done this presentation both at, well, not for you all, but also for the Kairos Institute conference that was held in 2022 at Calvin, just across town, and also up in Grand Haven at the library there, because the community wanted to know, what is this thing called critical race theory? Is it a threat to the democracy? Is it a bunch of lefties and communists who are just out there stirring up trouble because that's what they can do? And when I put this together originally, I said, you know, what came across my mind was the fact that there is this African proverb that says, until the lions have their own historians, tales of the hunt shall always be glorified by the hunter. Because after all, the lion is always dead at the end of the hunt, right? So as powerful as the lion is, we never get to hear their side of the story. Let's start here. 1912 in Mississippi. Now, in 1912 in Mississippi, there was a man named Julius Rosenwald, very prosperous man, very prosperous Jewish man, Rosenwald, who had an idea for addressing issues of education. Julius Rosenwald was a friend of Booker T. Washington. Now, this is the same Booker T. Washington who in 1895 at the Cotton States Exposition speech conference, big gathering, kind of like the Chicago World's Fair that would be later on, Booker T. Washington gave a speech where he said, listen, as the president of Tuskegee Institute, he had to raise money like any college president. He had to raise money for his school. And given the fact that it was a black school in deep South Tuskegee, Alabama, Booker T. Washington, being a black man in 1915, 1912, had to be very careful about how he presented his case for getting money for education. So Booker T. Washington said at the Cotton States Exposition speech in 1895, listen, don't worry about anything. You know us. You can trust us. We took care of your children, your fathers and your mothers when they were sick. You have spent entire generations with us. Cast down your bucket where you are. All these people who are coming from Italy and Ireland and every place is overseas, now after the World War I's going on, those are foreigners. You know us. We've been here with you the whole time. He said that we can be as separate in the hand, like the fingers on the hand, but still be united in all things for the general building of the country. In 1912, Booker T. Washington's mostly white audience in the South needed to hear that so they would not feel threatened about a revolution of some type. But he also understood that the people that he was trying to get that money for, his black students, black people throughout the South, needed an education. Julius Rosenwald knew that as well. Julius Rosenwald went to the South building what was called, we now know of as the Rosenwald Schools. He built more than 5,000 of them throughout the South. Booker T. Washington, like W.B. Du Bois, there was a great debate between Dr. Du Bois, who was born in 1868 in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, and Booker T. Washington, who was born in 1856 in Roanoke, Virginia. Now, Washington, having spent 9 years as a slave, and Du Bois, not having spent 1 day of his life as a slave, had 2 different views of how to approach the issue of lifting black people up. Washington said, what good does it do if you know how to spell the most fancy word, you can go to a play, you get elected to Congress, but your people can't feed themselves, you have no place to live, you don't have a job, you can't grow your own food. So he believed in what they called industrial education. Du Bois said, first of all, the economy should be such that we should get a job wherever we want for whatever skill we have. If I want to go to a play or be elected to Congress, I should not have to put that on the back burner just because you don't think it's ready right now. So these 2 very prominent black leaders both were arguing about education. They disagreed about their approach, but they both agreed on this one fact. Education was the key to uplift and advancement. Julius Rosenwald built these schools to address that problem in his own way. In 1961, the school in New Harmony, Mississippi, closed. Now, in 1961, in Mississippi, the schools are segregated. There's a woman named Winston Hudson African-American woman named Winston Hudson, who, finding out that the school was going to be closed, she said, you know what, I'm not in the mood to play these kind of games. So she got busy to make sure that the school would stay open. So she contacted the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, which at that point, NAACP had been founded right around 1915, the same year that Booker T. Washington died. So she contacted NAACP and lobbied to get them to come down, their legal team to come down and see if the school could stay open. The person they hired, the lead lawyer for this project, was Derek Bell. Now, scholars of the Grand Forum, I got to tell you something. Whenever I'm talking to people about critical race theory, they don't know what it is and they're all up in arms about it, I ask one question. Do you know who Derek Bell is? If they tell me no, I walk away. Because I've had more birthdays since I last saw you. I don't have time anymore for people to waste my time. The least thing we can do is have an informed discussion. So Derek Bell was the one who came down from New York City, the NAACP office in New York City, and Derek Bell took the case and won. Now, Bell, in looking at this, said, you know what? The school is segregated. It's got poor facilities, poor school books if it has them. In other words, it was segregated schooling in 1961. Brown versus Board of Education was about 7 years old. So school desegregation, even though the Brown versus Board of Education case said school must end with all due deliberate speed, that's what the Supreme Court said. But here's the question. When someone says you can no longer have segregated schools and you must end this practice with all due deliberate speed, what does that mean? All due deliberate speed. Let me get it done in 3 days? 3 years? 3,000 years? What's the timeline when all this is supposed to be taking place? So they eventually worked toward, Derek Bell said, look, he told Winston Hudson, instead of fighting to just keep a poor school open, you should fight for school integration. Because after all, on the other side of town, that's where they have good schools, good facilities, roofs that aren't leaking, good school books, great teachers. We have great teachers over here, but then we have great teachers everywhere. So she said, yes, let's do that. Let's integrate the schools. Well, years later, bear with me as I read, please. Years later, Bell began to question the efficacy, that is, the quality of both the case and the drive for integration. He began to have second doubts. Now, here's the man who was the lead lawyer on a school desegregation case. And years later, he begins to wonder, did I do the right thing? Throughout the South, such rulings sparked white flight from the public schools and the creation of private segregation academies. Derek Bell began to notice something. This very talented lawyer began to notice that, well, when a school got desegregated over here, what happened was that the white students and their parents just moved over there, took the money and the funds with them. So this school eventually, with black parents, struggling economically like they were, would fall into the same condition eventually over. So eventually, people started segregating by virtue of movement and what they call white flight. Or they would establish private schools to include private Christian schools where you have to pay tuition, and they can be very selective about who gets in. That's another way of saying this is a private institution, the government state or federal government has no jurisdiction here. That's another way to achieve the same end through a different path. So in the end, it meant that black students still attended institutions that were effectively separate. Years later, after Winston Hudson's victory had become part of the civil rights history, she and Bell, the lady who was going to take the original suit to just keep the school open, and Bell convinced her, no, you should fight for more than that. You should go let the school be shut down and go for school integration. Years later, she and Derek Bell are meeting. Now track with me here in the story. Derek Bell, lead lawyer, school desegregation case. He meets the woman who wanted to just keep the black school open, and eventually tells her, I wonder whether I gave you the right advice. In other words, I wonder if I told you to do the right thing and not just keeping the black school open. Yeah, it had deficient facilities. Yeah, the books weren't great. Yeah, we had great teachers and they didn't have very many resources. But I wonder if I told you to do the right thing by pushing for school integration. Winston Hudson said, yeah, I wonder if you told me to do the right thing too. Bell spent the second half of his career as an academic, and now Derek Bell will eventually go on to teach law school at Harvard, NYU. He'll go on a one-man strike because Harvard's law school didn't hire any women on the law faculty at that time. They eventually will, but he stages a long protest just by himself to get them to hire more women on the faculty, or should I say women period on the faculty at Harvard. But as you see here, Bell spent the second half of his career as an academic, and over time, he came to realize that other decisions in landmark case, civil rights cases, were of limited practical impact. In other words, we passed a law. Somebody says, we have segregation. Okay, we took it to the court. The Supreme Court, for God's sake, said it is not allowed by the Constitution of the United States, specifically the 14th Amendment, and specifically the Equal Protections Clause, passed in 1866, an outgrowth of the civil rights of the Civil War, and yet, you have an amendment to the Constitution, and it seems like the same problem is still persisting again and again and again. He said that the decisions on landmark civil rights cases were of limited practical impact. He drew an unsettling conclusion. Derek Bell concluded, as the man who had argued for integration and then had spent another few decades looking at how nothing seemed to be changing, he concluded that racism was so deeply rooted in the makeup of American society that it has been able to reassert itself after each successive wave of reform aimed at eliminating it. In other words, every time we take 3 steps forward, there's 4 steps backwards. So if you've ever heard of the thing called whack-a-mole, where you hit it over here, and it pops up over there. You hit it over here, and it pops up over there. You can bang it down for the moment, and it goes away right for that moment, but only for that moment. At some point, Derek Bell begins to conclude it's going to pop up over here, and he begins to wonder, is it just baked into America's DNA? Is it within the system? Whatever it is, political, economic, social systems, whatever it is, the academic systems, is it just there as a thing of being part of America? So deeply rooted in the makeup of American society that it has been able to reassert itself after each successive wave of reform aimed at eliminating it. Racism, he began to argue, is permanent. Derek Bell began to say, every generation will have to fight the same disease in its new form. Now, on the one hand, you might say, well, that's a statement of the obvious, right? If you are a believer in the Christ and you know that we are a fallen species, of course we're going to do this to each other. So 2 + 2 = 4. Well, that's okay if you're not on the receiving end of whatever's happening there. Bell was growing doubtful about the prospect of ever achieving racial equality in the United States. The civil rights movement had been based on the idea that the American system could be made to live up to the democratic creed prescribed in its founding documents. Some of you remember the last speech that the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. made before he was assassinated the next day. That last speech, he said, all we say to America is be truthful to what you said on paper, the Constitution, or more specifically, the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. All we say to America is be true to what you said on paper. Be true to what you said on paper. He said, if I was in Russia or China, one of those countries over there, I wouldn't expect any of this because they have not committed themselves to that ideal, that standard. But we have. Just do what you said you were going to do in the Constitution. Not the 1787 Constitution, the updated Constitution after the Civil War. The 1787 Constitution had 3 specific clauses that not only recognized, but made sure slavery will become part of the body politic for the nation until it had no other outcome but a civil war. A civil war that had been fought to, among other things, get rid of slavery. A 13th Amendment had been passed that abolished slavery by constitutional law mandate, legal mandate, because Abraham Lincoln knew that if you didn't do it by legal mandate to attach to the Constitution, it would come back again. Why do we know that? Because it had been done many times before. The 14th Amendment to do what? Things like dual citizenship. Why dual citizenship? Because in 1860, when they took the census, there were 31 million people in the U.S., 22 million in the North, 9 million in the South. Of the 9 million in the South, there were 3.5 to 4 million people who were black slaves. So after the Civil War, there's no more slavery, but they're also not citizens. What do you do with them? They're not property anymore. They didn't sneak across the border. They were born right here. What do you call them? So the 14th Amendment said that, among other things, you are a citizen of the state where you are born and of the nation to which that state belongs. Dual citizenship. A Reconstruction Amendment. This is why I tell my students all the time at Hope College, be very careful of being in a rush to change the language on citizenship. You could very well write yourself out of citizenship, as happened in 1935 during the Nuremberg laws in Nazi Germany when Jews found out like that. Stroke of a pen, many Germans who happened to be Jewish and saw themselves as being citizens were completely flabbergasted and surprised to discover that someone just decided, no, you're not. But I served in World War I, I served the fatherland, and your point's what? Bell had begun to think that the system was working exactly as it was intended to, that was why progress was invariably met with reversal. Indeed, by the 1980s, it was increasingly clear that the momentum to desegregate schools had stalled. Folk, scholars of the Grand Forum, by the 1980s, that would be what? 36 years after Brown v. Board in 1954. 26 years. So a quarter century went by, and this very astute, very observant, very smart, very intelligent legal scholar is saying, you know what? I'm looking around the landscape, I don't see much difference. A 2006 study by the Civil Rights Project at UCLA found that many of the advances made in the first years had been erased during the 90s, and that 73% of black students around that time attended schools in which most students were minorities. Fast forward to 2022. By 2022, critical race theory had become the hobgoblin that everybody loved to hate, or at least be upset about. And the question that becomes, this is from the NAACP website. Critical race theory, or CRT, is an academic and legal framework that denotes that systemic racism is part of American society. That it is just here. Like, blood being red, water being wet, the ground being hard, there being gravity. It's not personal, it just is. From education and housing to employment and healthcare, critical race theory recognizes that racism is more than the result of individual bias and prejudice. It is embedded in laws, policies, and institutions that uphold and reproduce racial inequalities. According to CRT, the theory, societal issues like Black Americans' higher mortality rate, outsized exposure to police violence, the school-to-prison pipeline, denial of affordable housing, and the rates of the death of Black women in childbirth are not unrelated anomalies. In other words, these things that keep happening from one decade to the next, again and again and again. Then there are social problems, social programs. Then you throw money at them. Then you do something called, urban renewal and development or whatnot. But these things keep on happening again and again and again. Now, is it as a result of the fact that the people's character is so deficient that this keeps happening? Or could it possibly be something else? We understand about individual character, individual effort. That's going to always be a priority when it comes to a person's fate. But could it be possibly that there might be something else operating there to reproduce these situations again and again and again and again, so routinely, so predictably? The term critical race theory has been co-opted by opponents as a catch-all and rallying cry to silence any discussions about systemic racism, ban the truthful teaching of American history, and you all, I know you all are well-read enough and well-informed enough to know about all the book banning going on around the country, right, for whatever subject it is. And by the way, it doesn't really need, whatever the subject is, some people are talking about sexual content, historical, immigration, whatever it is, just note this much, that people, as the students, George Orwell and other social commentators have said that when a society begins burning its books, let's just say that when a society begins burning its books, it's not a good sign for that society. Whatever the cause, whatever the reason. The term has been unjustifiably used to include all diversity and inclusion efforts, race-conscious policies, and education about racism, whether or not they draw from CRT. Attempts to ban CRT are really attacks on free speech, on discussions about the truthful history of race and racism in the U.S. and the lived experiences of black people and other people of color. This subject has been very much on my mind this year, because in the fall of 2023, Hope College has redone its curriculum, and because we have redone our curriculum, I will, for the first time, be teaching a brand new class called Race and Ethnicity. Now, I normally teach a class every 2 or 3 semesters called Slavery and Race in America, 1619 to present. But that one, I can pretty much couch it over here, park it over here by saying, like, slavery and race in America. Slavery happened way back then. There are no slaves today that we know of, unless you don't count human trafficking, particularly human sex trafficking in America. But the slavery of the 19th century, that had been done away with, Civil War, Emancipation Proclamation, all that stuff. So that's pretty much in the midst of history. I can talk about that in a somewhat neutral environment. But race and ethnicity, those are live topics right now that are all being seasoned by or texturized by this one. Lawmakers and proponents of the ban insist they are advocating for a balanced and patriotic education. However, these bans do the exact opposite. They deny the truth about our nation's history, silence dissent, and punish those who speak the truth to counter whitewashed falsehoods. One of the charges of CRT has been that white students are being taught to feel guilty about themselves and be responsible. Let me share with you all what I tell my students every time on day 1 of the slavery and race class. I tell my white students, and they're usually mostly white. Every now and then I get some students of color. But I tell my white students, listen, if you want to come here feeling guilty, prepared to feel guilty about something, I need you to park that outside the door. Guilt, shame, park it, leave it out there. And for my students of color, when I do have them, I say, if you come here frustrated and angry about stuff, I need you to take your frustration and anger outside the door. I said, I've asked them one time, I said, how many of you have really been beat to within an inch of your life by the police? Nobody raised their hand. I said, okay, I'm only one. And I'm not mad about it anymore. So, whatever your struggles are, whatever your challenges have been, leave them outside the door. Guilt, shame, anger, frustration. Why? Because this is a history class. And it's going to be hard enough for me to talk about slavery, the Underground Railroad, lynching, Jim Crow laws, neighborhood covenants, all that stuff. That's going to be upsetting enough. I can't do that and get the facts of that to you if I got to then also plow through shame and guilt and frustration and anger. So leave that out there, because my belief as an educator, as your professor, is this. In a Christian school, I have to believe with faith that if we put all the facts on the table and be honest with ourselves about what's been going on, We sit down and look at this objectively and figure out a way to come together as brothers and sisters and make this constitutional democratic republic what the founding fathers intended for it to be. But I can't do that if I got to burrow through all that other stuff. I'm still trying to figure out how I'm going to start my race and ethnicity class. Now, these are the places, some of the places where critical race theory has been taught and people are opposed to it. So what do we do now? What do we do now? You see, because part of it, I understand why some people don't want to talk about this history. It's tough. This is tough stuff. But I'm teaching a class also for Aquinas called African Americans Who Defend Democracy. Black people have defended democracy since the American Revolution, the Civil War, 250,000 black men fighting for the Union Army, fighting for a country that just a few years earlier said that the best thing we can do for you is deport you back to Africa. World War I, Spanish-American War, World War II. Frank Peterson, first black general of the Marine Corps, B.O. Davis, whose son, B.O. Davis Jr., was a Tuskegee Airman. You have to ask yourself, why are these guys crazy? They're the best of the best of the best, yet they're defending America. Something's going on. There must be something valuable in the country. There must be something being the secret sauce that makes them want to do it. But they're doing it with their understanding. Even Colin Powell, I did a presentation on him just a few days ago. Colin Powell pointed out that, yes, even when he was in Vietnam in 1963, while he was in Vietnam in 1963, his wife was in Birmingham, Alabama, doing what? Putting up with the biggest down there. While he's in Vietnam, 1,000 miles away, fighting communism. It is the dichotomy that we exist in as Americans. This is our history. But I just don't know that we get better by not confronting it honestly and truthfully, and then without trying to make somebody be responsible for it right now. When I found people trying to do that, I said, now you are wrong. You don't get to do that in my classroom. Why, they asked. I said, because I'm in charge, that's why. Okay. Any questions so far? I know some of y'all have to leave by 2. Keep going? All right, we'll keep going. Let me just assure you of this too. Whenever I'm having just a regular standard day, and I get a phone call, Dr. Johnson, can you come and talk to us about lynching? Like, yeah, sure. I was hoping somebody would call me with that. People ask to talk about this kind of stuff because we don't know it. We don't know enough about it. In 2020, when Derek Chauvin had his knee on George Floyd's neck, and then 2021, I got calls from around the country. Remember, people were just still finding out that Zoom was doing all it could do. I got calls from around the country. What's this thing going on with Tulsa? I said, what do you mean what's going on in Tulsa? What's happening in Tulsa? 1921, I said, I wasn't born then. You're talking about the Tulsa race riot. In 2021, it was 100 years old. There were so many people that didn't know about it and wanted presentations on it. And I said, how was it possible? How is it possible that a community that was the wealthiest black community in America could be pillaged, plundered, and hear me closely, airplanes dropping turpentine balls on the roofs of homes and businesses, setting them aflame? That's right, American citizens having their homes and businesses bombed inside the U.S. Not Kabul, not Islamabad, not someplace overseas, but in Tulsa, Oklahoma, middle America. How is that possible in 1921? And then for the next 100 years, people don't hear about it. On the one hand, it's because the people who are the targets, they're too scared, and the ones who are the perpetrators, they don't think it's important enough. Because a culture of impunity will do that for you. You can do that kind of thing and get away with it because, after all, who's going to come up and ask you about it and arrest you? So this truth hurts. And it often has the feeling of, here we go again. Here's why, one of many reasons why we want to tell the truth about American history. In 1950, and this is just one, I tried to find the examples that would be the most salient, the most easily accessible. In 1915, D. Deborah Griffith, a fantastic filmmaker. Now let me pace myself here. D. Deborah Griffith was a fantastic filmmaker who made a film entitled Birth of a Nation. Now I say fantastic filmmaker, not tongue-in-cheek, not being sarcastic, because what D. Deborah Griffith did in making Birth of a Nation, it changed things just like the way Francis Ford Coppola's The Godfather did. You couldn't make mob movies after that had to be made differently. In 1977, when George Lucas came out with Star Wars, whatever science fiction it was up to that point had to be done differently. He set filmmaking up so that however movies were being made, D. Deborah Griffith, the way that he did it, the lighting, the camera angle, all that kind of stuff that you do to make a film, he completely revolutionized it and made a film that made people's eyes bug out. Now, the story he told in the film was terrible, because the story he told was based on a book entitled The Klansman, written by Thomas Dixon, which told a story of a South defeated by the North in the Civil War. And this is, I don't have the video, I mean, I'll bring you that next week, but in this one particular scene that I will show you all, you see it says a Southern black legislature somewhere in the South, some fictional town. And you see these legislatures, and look, let me just be blunt with you all. They're not looking very bright. They're not looking very serious. They're not looking very intelligent. And they're all looking up, especially that guy right there with you can see the white of his eyes. They just had a bunch of white visitors that have come into the Capitol of the Southern building, and they're all looking up at the nice white ladies dressed in their bonnets and their parasols. And to say that this legislature in the South, immediately after the Civil War, now the Civil War was the world's first modern war, and it produced all the things that modern wars produce: tragedy, refugees, misery, disease, heartache, spiritual dislocation or spiritual evacuation, everything you can imagine. Anything you can think of bad about a war, the Civil War was that. And by that I mean, by the end of the war, it was no longer just armies beating each other on the battlefield. By the end of the Civil War, the Northern generals, Ulysses S. Grant in particular, had figured out that to defeat the South, you had to not only defeat the army in the field, you had to defeat the Southern populace, destroy their economy, their crops, their animals, their homes, their churches, their roads, because that's what allowed them to make war in the first place. So now war becomes waging war on civilian populations, the way we do it today. So in that environment, so this story told, these black legislators are not paying attention to the needs of the people. The first piece of legislation they pass in the movie is that black people and white people can intermarry, because that's at the top of their minds. So the story went, and in the story, there's this guy, this character named Gus. Now Gus, just in case there's not enough irony in your life, Gus is a white man in blackface. Now Gus has his eyes on a young lady, and in the movie, Gus tells this lady, "I want to marry you." Now, Grand Forum scholars, imagine a movie house in 1915. 1915 being what it was. And all of a sudden, Americans in 1915 see a white guy in blackface telling her, "I want to marry you." Not going to go over well. Well, she, of course, was horrified and said no and took off running up the hill. Gus, and look, don't think that wild look on his face is accidental. Gus is determined to have her. Gus is determined to have her by any means necessary, to include by force if that's what he wants. She gets to the top of the mountain and says, "If you keep coming after me, I'm going to jump." Well, he keeps coming. She jumps to her death. Now, in the movie, there is a former Confederate officer. That's his niece. She's jumped to her death, and he goes, "Oh my God, what am I going to do? These black soldiers just running around. They're abusing us. They're killing people. They're stuffing the ballot box. The Republicans are making it possible for them. The black Republicans are doing this. The scalawags, the carpetbaggers, they're terrible. What are we going to do to restore order and dignity and nobility to the South?" Well, he seizes upon, somebody remembers that black people are afraid of ghosts. What happens if the ghosts of dead Confederate soldiers suddenly rise from the grave to take out their vengeance? Scholars of the Grand Forum, this solution to the problem of an out-of-control black race in 1915, this movie was released and shown in movie houses across the country. And keep in mind, this is brand new technology, which means that in 1915, this is a powerful technology. So people are blown away by the newness of the technology, and they are, and D. Deborah Griffith, like any other filmmaker, he's not going to get up and tell a story he knows people are not going to like. He tells a story that people will understand and will accept and believe and will applaud to. And at the end of just about every showing, people do have mass applause, standing ovation. The solution to the problem is the Ku Klux Klan, which was actually founded in 1866 in Pulaski, Tennessee. If you've been following the news out of Tennessee, you know Tennessee is the gift that keeps on giving. So poor Gus is taken into the clutches of the KKK and punished, and by the time the movie's over with, the KKK is riding through towns on horseback, saving the Southern people, restoring order, and putting people in their place, fill in the blank where you need to. Woodrow Wilson, who was the president in 1915, said, the white men were roused by a mere instinct of self-preservation until at last there had sprung into existence a great Ku Klux Klan, a veritable empire of the South to protect the Southern country. Now, folk, Woodrow Wilson really should have known better. He was, I think, the president of Princeton and a PhD political scientist. And yet there he was. They showed the film in the White House, and this was his response. In 1915, the modern Ku Klux Klan, that's right, the one that you and I are living with, the modern Ku Klux Klan was reborn because by 1915, the Ku Klux Klan that had been founded in 1866, by 1915, 1866, 34 years, 1900, by 1900, Reconstruction was over. The case of Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896, where Homer Plessy, an octoroon, which means he was 1/8 black. How you figure that out in 1896, I don't know. But Homer Plessy, a black man, a very white-looking black man, was riding in the white car on a railroad train in Louisiana. He was discovered intentionally, thrown into the black car. The case went to court. The Supreme Court said that, well, you know, when we did that thing with the 14th Amendment with dual citizenship and equal protection of the law and due process, we didn't really mean that civil rights were going to be a thing that the federal government would enforce. We will enforce it if it's a federal crime. At the state level, Louisiana is in charge of its own civil rights. Can I ask you all a question? Can I just ask you a question? If you're a black person in 1866 or 1896 and you're living in Louisiana, do you trust Louisiana to do the right thing? Do you? If you do, stay after class. We have to have a conversation. 1896, the Supreme Court ruled that as long as the accommodations were equal, they could be legally separated. Hence, the principle separate but equal in 1896, 4 years before the start of the 20th century. You know that thing that you and I just left a few years ago? That became the standard. And by 1915, so the standard is separate but equal in 1896. By 1900, the black people that had been freed by slavery, now they're sharecropping and doing something called chain gang peonage labor. We'll talk about that later on. The 14th Amendment has been pretty much neutered and gutted. The 15th Amendment gave, sadly, only black men the right to vote, but even black men by 1900, they can't do that because the terrorism, the intimidation, grandfather clauses, poll taxes, literacy tests, all that had pretty much made voting by black people, male or female, a non-existent activity. Folks, this is why in 1965, Lyndon Johnson had to do what? Sign the 1965 Voting Rights Act. If you can vote for the 15th Amendment, why do you need more legislation? This is what Derek Bell is talking about. We solve this problem, then we got to do it again through congressional legislation. Then Supreme Court amendment or something over here. It keeps coming up again and again and again. But in this instance, the Ku Klux Klan had done its job. We were in our place, so to speak. But when this movie came out in Stone Mountain, Georgia, Even today, there's carved into the granite side of the mountain a statue of carvings of Robert E. Lee, Thomas Jonathan Jackson, and Jefferson Davis, the former president of the Confederacy. At Stone Mountain, Georgia, the modern-day Ku Klux Klan was reborn. The Klan that will bomb that church in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963. The Klan that will attempt several times on Martin Luther King Jr.'s life. The Klan that will shoot Medgar Evers in his driveway in 1961. The Klan that will harass and terror. The Klan that will kill Viola Liuzzo, the blonde white woman who leaves Detroit to go down south to help black civil rights workers with the vote. They'll kill her. That Ku Klux Klan. That Klan and the attitude that goes with it that results in the lynching of Lee Daniels in 1920 in Central Texas. And by the 1920s, that Ku Klux Klan will be marching down Pennsylvania Avenue. Now this is, and by the way, there are marches that they'll have in Grand Rapids too. Some of you all know about that. Now, when I look at this picture, here's what I see. In the background, that is the U.S. Congress in the background, meaning it's the people's house. It's my house. Our tax dollars are paying for that house and what's going on in it, the work that's supposed to be happening in there. Now, in the 1920s, in 1924, 25, 26, 27, 28, when these characters are marching down Pennsylvania Avenue outside of the people's house, I had to ask them questions. The question is this: do the people inside that house, the people representing the people, do they know that there's a terrorist organization marching outside? When I say terrorists, think like this: Al-Qaeda and ISIS. I don't mean as in somehow, some type of terrorism light because it's American style. I mean, no. Terrorism like the people that flew planes into the World Trade Center. Terrorism like ISIS that was setting people on fire a few years ago before we handled that situation too. These are domestic terrorists, first, last, always, period. Do the people inside that house know that there are domestic terrorists marching outside the house? If they do, what are they doing about it? Do they care? Because if they do know and they're not doing anything, I can only reach one conclusion: that they know, they don't care, or they know, and through either their support or lack of action, they're enabling that continuation of the terrorism. This went on through the 1920s. In the 1920s, the state of Indiana had more Ku Klux Klansmen in it than any other state in the Union. I've had students at Hope College, black students, telling me that when they're going down I-65, they pray to God they're not going to stop anywhere near I think it's Marion, Indiana, and some other towns. But they say they pray to God that their car does not stop today. The kind of activity, and the thing with Lee Daniels and that lynching photo, the thing that's important about that photo is not so much the person that's hanging from the trees. His problems are over with. Lee Daniels is dead. He's gone. We have to ask ourselves is this: what about the people who are standing beneath the body, looking into the eye of the camera? Look, when I was flying out here just now, I was looking through my back view mirror, my side view mirrors. I was looking for cops everywhere. I'm afraid of getting pulled over. But I said, my scholars are waiting on me. I got to get there. So how do you actually be present at a homicide and look into the eye of the camera? Like, I dare you to come and ask me a question. I dare you to come and question me. That's cultural. That's political. That's economic. Something in the water tells them I can be at the site of a lynching and stand there and do like this and doing that, hey, Ma, take a picture, and nothing's going to happen to me? How do they know that? That's what I want to know. How do they know they can kill someone and be there present and get away with it? How do they know that they can get away with that? Because something historical, cultural, political, economic tells them they can be there, the site where a man is tortured and lynched to death like that, and nobody's going to ask a question. They'll go home, eat that night, sleep well that night, and go to church on Sunday, and nothing's going to happen. How do they know that? How can they do that? And it comes about as a struggle against blame, hatred, violence. Let me share this with you. We'll close up right here. This was a Michigan, Detroit thing that happened. the Black Legion was founded in Southern Ohio by a dentist. The guys in the black robes, that's how they dressed. Now, they founded the Black Legion because this dentist thought that the Ku Klux Klan wasn't violent enough in harassing, well, Italian immigrants, Catholics, immigrants from the wrong part of Europe. And by the wrong part, I mean like from the Balkans area, Southeastern Europe, Turkey, Mediterranean Europe, because, not all Europeans are Europeans in the eyes of these guys. So they thought they weren't being vigorous enough or aggressive enough in what they were doing. And this is the founder, Dr. Sam Shepard, or William Shepard, founded in Southern Ohio, around Bel Air. As I mentioned, the Black Legion obviously they targeted black people. They targeted Jews, of course. They targeted Catholics. And the thing is, this suit may look ridiculous. I tell my students all the time, do not let the fact that they look ridiculous convince you that they are ridiculous. These folk are serious about their terror. So they're serious. They may look crazy, but their crazy should be taken into account. Let me get to my main point here. This will sound familiar to us. To get into the Black Legion, you couldn't just go find somebody and say, I want to join that organization. No, they'd have to find you. If you said the right thing or had the right attitude or, showed the right display, you just had to say the right little things to make sure that you're on their page. They would invite you to a little meeting out in the woods far enough away, and then you're there blindfolded on your knees with a pistol beside your head, and then they're asking you certain questions, such as, will you put this organization above any to which you now have belonged or ever hoped to? Would you be willing to forget your party and vote for the best man regardless of what party he belongs to? Are you willing to take orders and go to your death if necessary to carry them out? Do you believe in white supremacy and that no Negro should have authority over a white man? Do you believe in restricted immigration and deportation of all undesirable aliens? Would you oppose by ballot and if necessary by force of arms any attempt to place any portion of the public tax money in the hands of the Roman Catholic Church? You realize that in 1960, when John F. Kennedy ran for president, people were wondering if the President Kennedy would pay more attention to the Constitution than the Pope. 1960, a World War II veteran whose PT boat had been carved in half by a Japanese destroyer. They're asking him that question. If it should ever become necessary to lie to protect a member of this organization, would you do so if ordered by your superior officers? Scholars of the Grand Forum, can I just tell you all that these are the kind of questions that you would ask if you are trying to cultivate people who might one day overthrow a government. And look at this. What is your attitude toward lynch law? Are you kidding? I don't know. Let me think about it. A guy named Dayton Dean eventually found his conscience because the Black Legion, among other things, what they had done, they had, I think it was in 1936, 1937, there was a black man, look, it's 1936, 1937, so a black man was working with one of these guys. Of course, the black guy didn't know that it was the Black Legion. But they said, the leader of the local cell said, hey, go find me a black guy. So what for? What are you going to do with him? Well, we're going to take him out to the woods and just chase him down and shoot him. Why? Just want to see what it's like to shoot a black man. That was their reason. Well, Dayton Dean and his buddies ended up killing this guy, Charles Poole. Now, Charles Poole, to your eyes, looks very white, normal, Protestant, except that he's not Protestant. He's a Catholic. He worked for the worst progress administration and the Roosevelt administration. Charles Poole, somebody told them that Charles Poole, the Catholic, how dare he, was married to a Protestant woman named Becky. They also told him that found out that Charles Poole had apparently been beating up on his wife. Now, Becky at the time was pregnant when they decided they were going to get even with this guy. So they took Charles Poole out, beat him up, and put a bullet in his head too. How dare a Catholic beat up on a Protestant woman? Dean finally discovered that he had not been beating up on his wife, not that that would have made a difference anyway. None of their business. Charles Poole was not a wife beater or a wife abuser of any kind. He was just a husband trying to make a living for his family. And Dean confessed, and they went to trial. They were found guilty, spent many years in jail, and the Black Legion began to crumble apart. But this organization infiltrated unions, local government, Detroit, and some of the suburbs. Now, there are people who say we shouldn't teach this kind of history. My response is, how do we get better? Not knowing we haven't been so good. I believe in the American democratic system and in this constitutional republic. I tell my students all the time, they say you're too weak to take this. Are they right? They say you can't handle truth. Are they correct? They say you don't want to be equipped to deal in this democracy, which is a full participation score. Are they right? There's more to share with you. Understand that. And next week, when I'm here on time, we'll get into that. Thank you very much.